So we can go over our foreshadowing in Of Mice and Men. Now that we know what occurs in the end of our novel, with Lenny accidentally killing Curly's wife and George having to make this decision to end Lenny's life before the mob of ranchers, most likely led by Curly and Curly's father, killed Lenny. So foreshadowing is, we can say, pretty much throughout this entire book, including the chapters. So when we first meet Lenny and George, they are at this riverbank. That would be our chapter 1 setting. And we can definitely say here that the setting of our story comes full circle. They begin at the riverbank and they end at the riverbank. And when we meet Lenny, we could say it's foreshadowing his animalistic behavior, how he's snorting into the pool, drinking the dirty water, his paws. This we could use as foreshadowing to say that his animal, like, it's not a nice thing to say, but Steinbeck would be pointing to his animalistic qualities, saying that maybe here Lenny is similar to Candy's dog. And we know chapter 3 with Candy's dog was most definitely an example of foreshadowing because, and I'll go to that one. So we have him in the river, right? Actually, wait, in chapter 1 still, we can say that it's foreshadowing that something's going to happen and they end up back at the river because we learn that they have this plan. And you wouldn't really have a plan of escape with a friend who you didn't think was going to do something bad. So the fact that Lenny and George, well, George basically, gives Lenny this plan of what they have to do if something were to happen, that is foreshadowing that something will happen within the coming 5 chapters that leads them back to the riverbank. So we can say that. And we know that something bad had happened in Weed. So we could use what Lenny had previously did with that girl in Weed to foreshadow or give us a hint that he's going to have an issue with a woman. Because also in chapter 2, another piece of foreshadowing is specifically when George refers to Curly's wife as jailbait. Now, that's a weird terminology to use, calling her jailbait, because typically that's for, like, if nowadays that term would be used for a girl who's underage. So for George to use that term, watch out for her, she's jailbait. We could say that foreshadowed that Curly's wife was going to lead to something criminal for Lenny. And it did indeed happen that way. So definitely in chapter 2, when George is going to refer to Curly's wife as jailbait, and he also will say to Curly's wife, leave her alone, don't go near her, or George says that to Lenny. We could also say Curly in and of himself is foreshadowing when Candy warns George of, like, kind of the drama on the ranch. So the old man, the ranch dad, comes in. He's suspicious of Lenny and George. Remember, he thinks George uses Lenny, but not so bad. Here we learn. So this conversation between Candy and George is definitely foreshadowing because Candy basically predicts what happens in chapter 3. So he's saying Curly's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys, kind of like he's mad at them. This foreshadowing, because that's exactly what Curly's going to do with Lenny in chapter 3. So in chapter 3, we can say is probably our most suspenseful chapter. And Candy's dog is most definitely an example of foreshadowing. We can also say that Candy's dog is viewed as symbolic. And we could say that Candy's old dog that gets put down by Carlson symbolizes the weaker characters in the society, in the novel. You could say Candy's dog represents crooks. He's African American and disabled and old, and he doesn't really have any options for what happens when he really can't do anything. Then you have Candy, who owns the dog, right? You could say that the dog probably is the closest symbolism to Candy. Well, Candy and Lenny, because Lenny also gets shot in the same way the dog got shot. That's our foreshadowing, really. And when I go down the conversation in Weed, once again, more foreshadowing. You have George here explaining to Slim what happened. So them hiding in the irrigation ditch. We really learned that this would have been an example of vigilante justice, okay? Obviously different here because Lenny killed Curly's wife in this in the story. So different than what happened in Weed, but worse. You could say that this kind of the Weed situation also could show or foreshadow that Lenny's behavior is escalating. And we could attribute that to a lot of things. We could attribute it to the way when he kills a mouse, he gets a pup. You might not think that would make sense because maybe it doesn't. But Slim did drown a couple of the pups. So the giving Lenny one, they don't really see a lot of value in the pup's life. But they might not assume Lenny's going to kill the pup, right? They're not giving Lenny animals and saying, here, kill it. They are giving him a chance. The pup that Lenny becomes obsessed with, that he also ends up killing in chapter 5, we could say it's pretty much foreshadowed that he will end up killing the pup. Because in the first chapter he kills the mouse. In the beginning of the 5th chapter he kills the pup. And those incidents could definitely foreshadow what happens in the middle of chapter 5 when he kills Curly's wife. All right, now we have the dog. So Carlson, he says the dog stinks. He's also going to say, look at him now. He wasn't the best. So they're trying to basically convince Candy that his dog would be better off dead because he is sick and he's no good to anyone. He's no use. That is symbolic of Candy. We have Candy, a.k.a. the old swamper, a.k.a. the old man. He is missing a hand. He's elderly. His job here is just wash out the bunkhouse. He really has no use. So we can say Carlson putting down this dog. We could say the dog symbolizes Lenny because Lenny and Carlson, because Lenny is useful in society. He's useful in the sense that he's really strong and he could do all this work on the ranch, right? But as far as we could say he's symbolic, he needs to be cared for. He can't care for himself. If you just left Lenny to his own devices and George wasn't with him, something bad would have happened to Lenny. He would have gotten arrested, picked up, put in as Crooks says in chapter 5, Crooks says, what's going to happen to you if something happens to George? Lenny's gets really upset about that in chapter 5 at Crooks because he realizes he doesn't know. So Candy's dog and killing it would be symbolic of George in chapter 6. When George has to take the same gun, this is also our example of foreshadowing. Because when Carlson's going to pull his gun out here, George takes a notice of it. So George gets that same gun that we know is there from chapter 3 and uses it on Lenny. So that would be examples of foreshadowing in chapters 1, 2, and 3 that would give us hints at the end of what's going to happen. You could also say there is foreshadowing in chapter 4. Now, this was a very cruel comment that Curly's wife made to Crooks, where she said, chapter 5 is like our outcast chapter, right? Or chapter 4 is our outcast chapter, where all the other men were out for a night on the town. And we had Crooks in his barn, where he's segregated from the other men, because remember, Crooks is our only black character. And Lenny comes in, because that's where his pup is. And then, so Lenny's our other outcast, not invited, because he's intellectually disabled. He can't be out with the men at a bar or a brothel. They were technically at a brothel. And then Candy comes in. That's our third outcast, elderly disabled Candy. And they're chatting about their plans for getting this piece of land. And other foreshadows too. You could say it's foreshadowing that they don't end up with their piece of land. Because Crook says, I've seen hundreds of men on the road. You could use the conversations or those negative lines of dialogue where other characters doubt George and Lenny's their goal, right? You could use these lines to say, Crooks saying he's seen plenty of men come and go foreshadows that Lenny and George's dream of owning this ranch all to themselves and living off the fat of the land is not foreseeable. It's not a realistic dream. And as we see at the end of the story, it wasn't. Candy, when he offered the money and said, I have money saved, I could put in, that kind of made us think it could be more realistic. But then Crooks here, he's kind of bringing us back to reality that there's no way they're going to be able to have this dream. Another person that brings us back into reality is Curly's wife. She's our fourth outcast in chapter 4. And we have her coming in. Where's Curly? Anybody seen Curly? Her usual, right? But in actuality, you also see her contradict herself, because then she says she knows exactly where they are. I don't know where they all went. So once again, we have Curly's wife trying to socialize in a place where she is an outcast, because not only is she not only is she a woman, but she's specifically the boss's son's wife. So they're all scared of her. They're scared of Curly, and they don't want to lose their jobs, because remember, we still have this Great Depression era. They're desperate for this employment, especially Candy and Crooks. So they especially don't want any trouble with the boss's son's wife. And we have here, when she says, so she knows what happened to Lenny, and they're not going to, or what happened to her husband and Lenny, she's not going to tell. We could say Lenny busting up Curly. That also foreshadows his busting up his wife or murdering his wife, because this is his example of Lenny doesn't know his own strength. So if you wanted to use the foreshadowing from chapter 3 to show when Lenny snaps, we wouldn't say he exactly snapped. In that case, George told Lenny to crush George told Lenny to crush Curly's hand. But it definitely foreshadows Lenny's incredible strength, right? So, another piece of foreshadowing in chapter 4, you could say, when Curly's wife says all of these hateful, racist remarks to Crooks, that she could get him strung up on a tree, we would say here that this definitely foreshadows why George feels the need to go kill Lenny himself, because George, this is the mentality of people in this ranch or this time period, especially out in California in the 1930s. You wouldn't have had these like formal police departments that we kind of have today. So if someone was accused of murder, in this case, she was just going to say that Crooks assaulted her. And we can assume that Crooks would be the lowest on this social hierarchy here because of the color of his skin. And Curly's wife, she could still play this victim card. So Curly's wife, we could say, has maybe more power on the ranch than Crooks, but she's most definitely our loneliest character. We could see her lashing out here. This is a very cruel thing to say. And her comments foreshadow that these men are seeking a vigilante type of justice, and they would have hunted Lenny down and probably brutally killed him. That would be the foreshadowing, and that could give us some explanation as to why George makes that decision at the end to kill his own friend. And you could say it foreshadows this idea of putting someone out of their misery, similar to what Carlson said about Candy's dog, because what would have been left for Lenny after Curly's wife's body was discovered would have been brutality, would have been really cruel. So George, in the end, we can interpret this as he makes a decision to save his friend's final moments, being that of torture and fright, because Lenny would have been absolutely terrified. We saw how he acted when Curly beat him up. This would have been a next level. This would have been a really traumatic way to die. Obviously, any way to die is traumatic. But in George's case, what does he do? He has Lenny sit at this edge of the riverbed, and he uses Carlson's gun from chapter 3 to end his life. And then we could say, Lenny begged, let's do it now. Let's get that place now. Sure, we got to go. So basically, George ends his life peacefully, similar to Candy's dog. And you can also say, there was another line in chapter 3 where Candy is thinking about his dog. And Candy says, I wish I did it myself. You could say that that is also this line of foreshadowing Candy's regret that he didn't kill the dog himself, because George would have heard that, and that obviously really resonated with George, this whole experience with the dog. You can interpret it that way. So that would be our foreshadowing for Of Mice and Men.